Shutting down the U.S.-Mexico border. President Trump is threatening to deploy the military and close the border if Mexico doesn't move to stop a migrant caravan headed from the Honduras to the United States.
Yeah, we've seen these groups arrive at the border before, seeking asylum, claiming that they're escaping dire circumstances. But is it even possible to just shut down the border, to turn those asylum seekers away? Team 12's William Pitts is verifying it for us tonight.
This morning, the president tweeted a threat to close down the southern border. So let's verify. Can he actually do that, both legally and practically?
It all comes from this, a migrant caravan from Central America headed for the U.S.
The
president tweeting that Mexico should stop them or he would call up the military and close our southern border. He's called for the military before.
Until we can have a wall and proper security, we're going to be guarding our border with the military. That's a big step.
Except they can't really guard anything.
Well, there's something called posse comitatus. It's a law that says you can't use the military on U.S. soil. But there's a couple of catches. The U.S. military could be used for an advisory capacity. And it also doesn't apply to the National Guard.
That's how President Obama sent 1,200 troops. President Bush sent 6,000. So we can verify the president can use the military, just in a very narrow way.
Now, when it comes to immigration law, that's a little more complicated. Congress passes the actual immigration law, but the president is in charge of enforcing it. And he's given a lot of leeway on what he can and can't do.
But the president is in charge of the Border Patrol, who runs the border checkpoints and crossings. So technically the president could close them all. But they still have to let people who are here legally back in, so it wouldn't be completely closed. What about shutting immigration down completely? We can verify, according to a Supreme Court ruling from 1950, yes, he could. In fact, every president going back to at least Jimmy Carter has denied entire groups of people from coming to the U.S., from North Korean officials to Iranian and Syrian hackers to Cuban nationals. William Pitts, 12 News.